policy team. I'm here with a few of my colleagues from the Housing and Planning departments and our distinguished panelists. I want to thank San Jose State University for hosting the Racial Justice Symposium and for having us here tonight. Just want to note that we will be recording today's session and we will make it available on our website as well as a slide deck from today's presentation. We'll also try to get a PDF of the presentation into the chat. So if you'd like to follow along that way, you can. We will be using chat to drop links and communicate with you. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A and not the chat. That's less distracting if you put them in the Q&A. And we will have a bit of time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. So thank you. So we're going to be talking about the city of San Jose's history of segregation, its legacy and its impact on community members' lives today, and what the role of government is to address the harms caused by segregation. We have been directed to create spaces for learning and for conversations on these topics from our city council, as we've been examining segregation and its effects as part of our assessment of fair housing, which we will touch on later. We want to acknowledge that history can vary widely depending on who is doing the telling. We aim to acknowledge the racist history of the city of San Jose and provide examples of how that racism has impacted residents today. While this presentation discussion will highlight themes and stories of segregation, history, and impacts, this clearly is not a complete story. It's ever evolving and asks you to dive deeper into these stories, perhaps encourages you to reflect on your own history and family stories and discover more. So I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Tonight, we have Josh Ichimatsu. He's our policy manager in the Housing Department's policy team. He's going to be talking about the city's history of segregation. We have Connie Young Yu. Connie is an author and historian and was deeply involved in the recent city council resolution that apologized to Chinese immigrants and their descendants for acts of injustice and discrimination. She'll be sharing some of her family's history as it relates to the burning of Chinatown and the struggle many faced to find home. We'll hear from Maricela Lechuga, who's a Santa Clara Airport Commissioner, community organizer, and resident of the Reed Hillview Airport Buffer Zone. She's been a leader in the movement to close Reed Hillview Airport, and she'll share some of her personal family history as well as speak to the legacy of that area. Lastly, we'll hear from Ruth Guaita, our supervising planner in the planning department, who will speak to the need for fair housing and how that fits into the city's housing element process and provide you ways that you can get involved. So where do we begin? In countries such as New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and among tribal nations in the US, it is commonplace, even policy, to open events and gatherings by acknowledging the traditional indigenous inhabitants of that land. While some individuals and cultural and education institutions in the United States have adopted this custom, the vast majority have not. Given the topic of tonight's stories, we have chosen to acknowledge the Ohlone people in the land most of us stand and sit on. Acknowledgement is a simple, powerful way of showing respect and a step toward correcting the stories and practices that erase Indigenous people's history and culture and toward inviting and honoring the truth. The Bay Area has always been home to a group of Indigenous peoples called Ohlone. The word Ohlone comes from the name of a single Ohlone tribe, the Ohlone. There are actually about 58 different Ohlone tribes. The group is also sometimes called Costanoan. This word comes from Spanish term Costanoa, meaning native people of the coast. So as we open this event today, I'd like to offer this. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contribute their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are standing on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. We pay respects to their elders past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Thank you. Now I'll pass it over to Josh.
Hi, everybody. Actually, can we just pause a second? There was a request to turn on the captioning.
Oh, sure. There you go.
Thank you. So, well, first off, I also want to say I am third generation San Josean. And so, a lot of this is, our history. Some of it is painful to talk about, but I think this is an exercise that has to happen. So starting with this map. This is a map of San Jose. The brown lines are the city limits. It shows, also some of the rest of Santa Clara County. On this map, each dot represents 75 persons. Orange dots are non-Hispanic white residents. Purple dots are Asian and Pacific Islanders. Blue dots are Latino, Latina, Latinx people. And so just looking at the map, just like the where the colors are, you can see orange dots with some purple concentrated in the west and south, and blue and purple in the east. With this dot map, you can clearly see there are strong divisions of where people live on the basis of race and ethnicity. The simple fact is, we live in a segregated city in a segregated region. So, this is important because where we live impacts so many different things, access to education, to opportunities, to jobs, to cultural enrichment, to community. And it also comes with, where we live comes with exposure to potential health risks, to environmental hazards, to violence. We like to think that these things shouldn't be decided on the basis of race. We know that segregation is unjust, unfair. We consider it an ugly part of the US's history. And yet, here we are. So, we want to talk today a little bit about how we got here. So next slide, please. There are lots of different points at which we could start to tell the history of how San Jose came to be segregated. We choose to start with the early days, the 1850s, when California first became a state of the United States. These next few slides are about the early days of the start of California as a state. When California first became a state, the city of San Jose was the capital. The first governor of the state of California, Peter Hardman Burnett, when he gave his second State of the State address in San Jose, said, a war of extermination will continue to be waged until between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Burnett was a former slaveholder from Tennessee who wanted to create a whites-only American West. The state of California funded and armed private militias who had the mission of raiding tribal lands and killing Native people. The city of San Jose had laws which specifically targeted Native peoples as public nuisance. Next slide, please. When California became a US state, it was technically a free state where slavery was not legal. But in concession to slaveholding states, California enforced the Fugitive Slave Act, in which formerly enslaved people who escaped from slaveholding jurisdictions were to be recaptured and returned. And in many cases, California had a complicated ongoing relationship with slavery, with several rich and prominent families who owned slaves illegally and local authorities turning a blind eye. As an example, the family that is the namesake of Bascom Avenue, Dr. L.H. Bascom of San Jose, is reported to have been a slave owner. Next slide, please. Also in the early days of California, the state and local governments sanctioned illegal theft of land from Mexican landowners. Before California became a US state, it was part of Mexico. With the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War and ceded most of the American Southwest to the US committed to honor Mexican citizens' landholdings. But through fraud and violence, many Mexican land titles were overturned or stolen. As a local example, the Berryessa family, and namesake of the city's Berryessa district, was a major Mexican landowning family. Their land was taken from them, with multiple family members murdered by white settlers. Again and again, in the early days of California, there are these recurring themes around land and property ownership, about who could own land, about whose claims to the land was valid under the law. And all of this was racialized, given legitimacy under the law and enforced with violence. Next slide, please. From the days when California first became a state and until the period after World War II, a period of roughly 100 years, San Jose and the Santa Clara Valley were largely agricultural. Agricultural labor in California back then, as it is now, was largely made up of immigrant workers. In those days, it was immigrants from Mexico, from China, Japan, from the Punjab region of India, from the Philippines, from the Azores, a tiny group of islands off the coast of Portugal. These immigrants, so important for their labor, were exploited. Their rights were constrained, including the right to own property. They were allowed to live only in specific neighborhoods. In San Jose, these neighborhoods were places like Japantown, Highlandville, which Connie will talk about, Little Portugal, and the Socioeconomic neighborhood. Next slide, please. These immigrant neighborhoods, Socioeconomic, Japantown, Highlandville, Little Portugal, are all included in this map within the areas marked in red. This map is a map of San Jose from 1937. It was produced by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, a federally sponsored agency with which other similar federal institutions of the time is responsible for creating the 30-year mortgage, which made homeownership accessible for millions of American families and created incredible wealth, generational wealth, for millions of Americans. They helped create the American middle class as we know it. And as they did so, they also excluded millions of American families on the basis of race. This map is one of the infamous redlining maps, where neighborhoods were marked in red were deemed to be hazardous and bad for investment. Yellow neighborhoods were said to be in decline and risky investments. Lending was discouraged in red and yellow neighborhoods. Blue and green neighborhoods were supposedly good neighborhoods for investment, where lending was encouraged. And these designations were made largely, almost completely on the basis of race. The thing about the HOLC is they kept good records. They documented why they designated neighborhoods the way they did, and they were explicit about their racism. Red and yellow neighborhoods were extensively described in racial terms. So in the north there's circled neighborhoods that includes Japantown and the historic site of Highlandville, which Connie will be talking about. The write-up of these neighborhoods describes how the racial composition of the neighborhood is a quote detriment, and says that the neighborhood contains the largest concentrations of quote Orientals and Negroes in the city. The former site of the Reed Hillview Airport, which Maricela will be talking about, is at the eastern edge of this map. At the time the map was made, it wasn't in the city limits, but the adjacent neighborhoods, the nearest neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods which are also in the flight path of the airport, are the red line neighborhoods on the eastern edge of the map. These neighborhoods were described in the HLC evaluation as being, quote, racially undesirable because of the, quote, infiltration of Mexicans and the presence of Italians and Portuguese of, quote, the lower stratum. Next slide, please. After World War II, San Jose expanded rapidly. And so from 1950 to 1980, San Jose grew by over 140 square miles, which is approximately 10 times the size of the 1937 redlining map we just saw. The city added over 500,000 people and almost 200,000 units of housing. Most of this new housing was newly constructed single-family homes. This growth was supported by an aggressive municipal practice of annexation, of adding land to the city. The housing development was made possible by local government policies, which allowed the legal subdivision of large tracts of agricultural land into smaller parcels for single-family home development. And while largely privately financing, the funding for all this new housing construction never would have been possible, as I talked about a little bit earlier, without the guarantees from the federal government and quasi-federal institutions like the HOLC, the FHA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac, all of which had racist and racialized underwriting standards. The redlining maps are one example. Another example, racially restrictive covenants, which were private agreements recorded against the land, which allowed the sale of property to, as was typically the language in these documents, to members of the white race, end quote, were widespread and actively and explicitly encouraged by federal underwriters like the FHA. Also, all this new development was made possible with the massive federal and local investments in infrastructure. Without roads, freeways, the highways, the expressways, the utilities to connect everybody together, life would never have been possible in this rapidly suburbanizing region. The siting of these roads and freeways, had a segregating impact in and of themselves also. They were used to split up neighborhoods. Housing and community of color was bulldozed to make way for new freeways, with promised replacement housing never fully delivered. The freeways themselves became boundaries between neighborhoods, separating the right and wrong sides of the tracks. Like freeways, the siting of hazardous land uses like industry, heavy industry, or airports has been to the detriment of communities of color. Governmental decisions in the allocation of resources and programming also, like streets, parks, street trees, recreation centers, all of this, there have been historic disparities in the level of investment across neighborhood. These historic levels of inequitable investment and the ongoing feedback loop of how lack of public investment leads to lack of private investment. And all of this has gone on for generations, so long, as we talked about from the beginning of the state of California, that, that it becomes normalized. These days, because we have laws against discrimination, our biases are much less explicit, much less out in the open. We don't have the same sort of public statements from politicians about that we've had in the past. And so we get to thinking that where people live and the conditions in which people live are just the natural order of things. And we forget about the history, all the decisions, public and private, that got us here. So today, with our panelists, we want to take a couple deeper dives to unpack our history and current conditions, and to talk about segregation and what, and we'll end with what some things we can do moving forward. Elizabeth?
Yes, I was on mute. Thank you, Josh. I'll hand it over to Connie.
Well, I really appreciate Josh's presentation, which puts into context so many of the issues that are involved with the apology to Chinese for past injustices. And many historical references resonate with my presentation as well. So I'd like to begin by saying, showing this first picture, this slide of the Market Street fire. Could I have the slide, please? So the apology by the city of San Jose gained national and international attention, and this photograph appeared in the New York Times, the BBC, and all news networks. San Jose, the 10th largest city in America, capital of Silicon Valley, is now known for the burning down its Chinatown in 1887. But the apology was for a series of injustices and cruel acts the city perpetrated on its Chinese residents that led to the arson fire. The Chinese banned Chinese laundries. The city council banned Chinese laundries in wooden buildings. The city held the first state convention of the Anti-Chinese League in 1886, which would ban the Chinese from all workplaces, from immigration, from making a livelihood in America. The city of San Jose made plans to remove the Market Street Chinatown for the building of the new city hall and declared Chinatown a public nuisance on March 25th, 1887. 6 weeks later, before official actions could be taken, there was the most destructive fire San Jose had ever seen. The city rejoiced. News headlines announced San Jose's joy and Chinatown is dead forever. Meanwhile, homes and businesses were destroyed and people like my grandfather were homeless. They were homeless, impoverished refugees with no place to go and no workplace that would hire them. Next photo. So here's the apology ceremony, September 29th this year. And it was held at the Circle of Palms in downtown San Jose, right next to the Market Street Chinatown site, which is now the Fairmont Hotel. So at the public ceremony, Sam Liccardo read the entire resolution under the hot sun. It took 10 minutes. It was a deep apology for many official acts of cruelty and injustices and a recognition of the contributions of the Chinese and their resilience. They would not be driven out because 10 days after the fire, Chinese merchants had an agreement with John Heinlein to lease 5.5 acres of his pasture land to build a new Chinatown. But the city tried every means possible to prevent this from happening, denying John Heinlein permits for building a new Chinatown. But despite opposition from the city and citizenry, the construction of the new Chinatown was completed in 1888 and would last 44 years. The resolution documents the resistance of the Chinese, a triumph in combating institutionalized racism. So in reading this resolution toward the end, the mayor was getting hoarse. And when he got to the end, it was, be it therefore resolved that we use this resolution to be a teaching moment for the public to move forward toward justice for all. And there was a burst of applause and huge cheers from the audience. So you could see in the resolution that both, it's in 2 parts, both Jerry Wong and I and the mayor are holding it. Jerry and I worked with the city on the content of the resolution and planning the ceremony. Councilman Raul Perales, who's next to the mayor, sponsored the resolution as downtown and Japantown are in his district, and he had been planning this resolution for months. Otto Lee, supervisor of Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, and State Assembly member Evan Lowe both addressed the issue of anti-Asian hate, and there was an exuberant response from the audience. And the last on the bottom, you see a slide of the crowd and lions. The ceremony was held at high noon at the Circle of Palms, and we wanted it to be a celebration with a double lion dance, an ancient Chinese tradition essential for all important celebrations, driving away evil spirits and to welcome all good tidings. So the apology ceremony, it was like an announcement of a burden lifted, that the city acknowledged this happening and we could move forward. We Asian Americans have been working on these issues for a long, long time. And to have an official recognition that would go nationwide was really a victory. Next. So my personal story, because I certainly felt quite emotional during this time, because my grandfather was a resident of the Market Street Chinatown. This picture on the left is my grandfather's passport picture when he was 11 years old, coming to San Jose with his uncle to work in the Chinatown. He arrived in 1881, 1 year before the Chinese Exclusion Act. My father would say, "Good thing Grandpa came when he was 11 instead of a year later, or else we wouldn't be here." The Exclusion Act suspended the entry of Chinese laborers and prohibited the naturalization of Chinese persons from American citizenship. Grandpa spent almost his entire life in the US as an alien ineligible for citizenship. He never became a citizen. On the right is a photo of my grandfather, Young, with his married name is Yong Song Guang, but this is when he was the age of 21. He was a teenager when he left the ruins of Market Street, Chinatown, and went to San Francisco, Chinatown, to find work. Because he came to America before the Chinese exclusion law, he could apply for a re-entry permit. This allowed him to go back to the village to see his mother, who was widowed, and to be married. He returned to San Jose, but he could not bring his wife with him. He would find a way by becoming a merchant in the new Chinatown of Highlandville. It would be years of hardship and one immigration barrier after another, but finally, after a separation of 14 years, his wife could join him in San Jose. Next. So this is a news feature article at the San Jose Mercury Herald, and it shows my grandmother. There's my dad holding the flag of the new republic, and there's my uncle, who's the older one. He's only 3 years old, holding the American flag. So after all the bad press about Highlandville in its early years, it was the press actually called Highlandville Highland's hellhole. At last, here it is, January 14th, 1914, a good story. Chinese New Year in Chinatown, San Jose. It was just too colorful and festive to ignore. This even attracted a few tourists after this article. So they're in their best holiday clothes, my grandmother with her 2 sons, my dad with the flag, and the headline says of my dad, "A disciple of Confucius," which is better than in an earlier time when he would be called a little heathen. This good publicity affected improved relations between China and US after the revolution of 1911. My grandfather was a community leader of Highlandville and raised funds for Sun Yat-sen, who led the revolution to overthrow the dynastic rule in China. And he was China's first president. In the communities throughout the United States, the Chinatowns supported Sun Yat-sen and were very, very proud of the victory in the new republic and the fact that US and China were friends. So next. This is a class photo of Grant School, the 5th grade, 1923. This was a public school on the other side of the tracks, literally on the other side of the railroad tracks. This is a class photo of the 5th grade, shows children of immigrants, Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Italian, and in the upper grade, there were 2 African-American girls. My father, he's wearing a tie. He's sitting in the front row with his friend to his left, or his right, his Art Ing. They both loved American school, wanted to be playing basketball afterwards desperately. They hated Chinese school, which they had to attend at Temple every day. And after school, all of these children went to their own enclaves. The Chinese children went to their fenced-in Chinatown, and the Japanese children went next door to their neighborhood, and the Italians went to their neighborhood, and so on. But it was all within a very close district. And the wonderful thing was they attended the same school. And that is where my father learned his aspirations, his sense of patriotism for America, and also an incredible idealism that his teachers instilled in him, that he could be anything. So that was in school. So next. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Highlandville Parade of 1920. So it shows that certainly the children may be going to public school, but there was a very, very traditional Chinatown, and it was like a Cantonese village in America. All the festivals were celebrated in the lunar calendar, and Highlandville is actually famous among all the Chinatowns for having this particularly elaborate festival. It was called the Festival of the Hungry Ghosts. And it was the 14th day of the 7th month, a lot of festivities. And this was actually a serious parade. And we know this because these two boys at the end, they're holding a sign that says respectful silence. But obviously they feel very free now. This is 1920. They're walking outside the fence, their fenced in neighborhood, proud with the American flag in front, and then the glorious flag of their temple, the flag of the Temple of Five Gods. So the 8-foot high fence in the background was built during the construction of the Chinatown. And when Highland was building it, he had barbed wire on the top to prevent the would-be arsonists and vandals out. But the barbed wire was taken down, but remained over the years as a wall of protection for the Chinese community. So that's a very distinct segregated community there. Next. Next slide, please. Highlandville was torn down in 1932. The Depression and the Chinese exclusion law decimated the community. Chinese laborers disappeared from the valley. The Chinese merchants could not pay the rent. The Highland Company, headed by John Highland's daughter, Anna, went bankrupt. A bank took over the 5-acre property. In 1950, it was owned by the city of San Jose, and the site was the corporation yard and called by neighborhoods the Corp Yard. The Highlandville Chinatown was gone and forgotten. Next. My grandparents and my dad moved across the street to Japantown. This is a picture of the Young storefront, 655 North 6th Street. My grandfather, an alien ineligible for citizenship, was kept from buying land in California, but he could buy the home in his son's name. In 1939, when they moved to Southern California, my grandparents sold the store to their good neighbors, a Japanese family. 3 years later, this family and all other Japanese were forcibly evacuated and sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming concentration camp for 3.5 years. And at this point, Japantown was like a ghost town. There was still a community center for Filipinos, the new immigrants who came to the valley to work. And there was also a Chinese restaurant, but it was completely abandoned by, it looked abandoned. Fortunately, the land was, the stores and businesses owned by Japanese were protected by J.B. Peckham, who had power of attorney. So when the Japanese were released from camp, they found their homes and their businesses intact, and they could continue and thrive. So, okay, next. Okay, here's the Highlandville evacuation poster that a group of us made for a Japantown fair, street fair. And we wanted to show the archaeology that was going on in the Corp Yard, and reveal that, you know, this was Highlandville-Nihamachi archaeological dig. And I'm there as an advisor, but I was able to look at some of the findings and do some sifting, and found some shards of porcelain and pottery. And I found a marble my father must have lost in the backyard. And somebody else found a half of a child's jade bracelet. But most important, because we didn't find large, evidence, large artifacts, we found a sense of place. This was a community that was 2 blocks wide, 4 blocks long. It was smaller than the Market Street Chinatown with only 300 residents. These were merchants and their families, but it was home base to many workers who came for their mail, for holidays, for word about jobs, for refuge. At one time, for 44 years, it was home base. So here's what's happening today at that site. If you go, you know, to 6th and Jackson, you will see on Jackson Street this the sign 6th and Jackson and the flag of Japantown, and notice of the development proposal. You know, this is on the side of this chain fence on 6th Street. And there's a high rise that will be an apartment building and another high rise office buildings. And the last slide I have, I took this picture several days. This is North 6th Street, and it will be the site of a public park. And it will be called, or it already is called, Highlandville Park. It will have a children's playground, a monumental sculpture, a history wall, and art elements that will proudly tell the story of this place. A Chinatown that rose from the ashes that became Japantown, an enduring place of community open to all people in San Jose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. Next, we're going to hear from Marisela Lechuga.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Marisela Lechuga, and I have to say that my views are my own. I am not here on behalf of a single entity or employer. These are all my personal opinions. So next slide, please. As Josh talked about redlining and the red line district to the east of the map, I copied and pasted this picture because it shows the area of where the original location of the Reed Hillview Airport was. So the history of the airport starts with Garden City Airport in 1935, and it was located on somewhere between East San Antonio and Story Road and King Road. The exact location is really kind of unknown. I haven't been able to find it anywhere, but that's where it was. And so you see that it would have directly been flying over the area of San Jose that had the largest population of Mexicanos in the entire area. And it relocated in 1937 to where it currently is now on Ocala and Capitol Expressway. Next slide, please. This was a time where there was serious redlining. Wasn't just lines on a map. It had real consequences, and it was seen in a lot of different ways. But this is an example of the underinvestment in infrastructure. This was a street on this was East San Antonio in the 1950s. We were the last streets to be paved in the entire city of San Jose was in East San Jose. And it was because the community organized to put pressure on the city and the county to finally get the streets paved. Next slide. This was during all of these decisions that impact our communities are being done during a time where racism is pervasive in thinking and policy and the law, as others have mentioned. This is a picture of bracero being sprayed with DDT pesticides. My grandpa came to San Jose in the 1940s and was also sprayed with DDT pesticides and suffered with Alzheimer's in his later years as a result of this exposure. Next slide. So all of these decisions are these land use decisions and infrastructure decisions are being done during a time. Can you go back to the other slide? these were being done during a time where we also had, not only was it racist thinking, but we were left out of decision making because there were at-large elections. And so it was impossible for somebody from a poor community of color to who, you know, that was because we were systematically disenfranchised to climb to be able to win an at-large election when you're competing against people from other parts of town and who are white. So it wasn't until after the Voting Rights Act that found at-large elections to be unconstitutional that we finally got our first elected representative in 1980. And her name was Blanca Alvarado. And one of the things that she's famous for advocating is for the closure of Reed Hillview Airport. So next slide, please. You can imagine that she had her hands full with things, right? There's a huge need to try to make up for all of the bad decisions that have impacted our community for all this time, for all these decades. And the airport was one of them. She always came close, but was not able to be successful, missed it by just one vote on one occasion. And so our community has continued to deal with things like the airport. I live directly below the flight path, and I am a public opponent of the airport because it's a nuisance to me. The noise is unbearable, and it's stressful. And there's also plane crashes that happen because people are learning how to fly. Students are learning how to fly. Next slide, please. And I will say that there are some people that in the neighborhood that support the airport, but I, of course, am a public opponent of it. And so there had been many times, decades long fight to close the airport, and we always came close, but never were able to get a decision to support airport closure until this past August 17th, 2021, where there was the publication of an airborne lead study that found several different correlations between lead exposure in children's blood and the airport. Next slide, please. So this is it found that those living closest to the airport have higher lead levels. Those also during a time of high increased airport activity, there's also an increase in lead exposure in children's blood. Next slide, please. And also those living in the east, so downwind of the airport, so in the eastern western direction where the wind is blowing, also have increased lead levels. So these were some of the statistical correlations that were found between lead exposure and the Reed Hillview Airport. And if you don't know, lead is toxic. Lead can cause it can lower IQ, it can cause learning disabilities, attention issues, and a number of other health impacts. And this is extremely disturbing to me because this is where I grew up. This is the neighborhood where me and my siblings grew up. The majority of my family was raised. I have like 30 cousins just on my mom's side, and this is where we were all, pretty much so many of us have lived and we're only here because of redlining, right, to start with. And so it was extremely disturbing to me because there's so many schools in the area. There's the Boys and Girls Club, and it's just an example of environmental racism. Next slide, please. So I took it upon myself to start organizing with the neighbors around this issue, but there were already lots of organizations like Somos Mayfair who were organizing around this issue, including other people, including Working Partnerships, Surge at Sacred Heart. And Victor Vasquez from Somos Mayfair invited me to join the meetings, but I noticed that there weren't that many local residents that actually lived here involved. So that's where I kind of took initiative, and I got the Neighborhood Association involved, and the Natural Resource Defense Council, and Latina Coalition, and a couple others to join. And we started I initiated a public awareness campaign where we went door to door, informing the neighbors about the issues with the airport, not just the nuisance and the lead, but also some of this racist history, to engage in a critical conversation, more critical pedagogy informed by Paulo Freire's popular education model that he coined. And so the picture to the right here is us. Actually, that's my mom and dad. Helping to turn in the petitions. We were able to collect about 2,000 signatures from residents that live in the area in support of airport closure. Next slide, please. This is a picture from Latina Day of Action. Latina Coalition helped us with promote this event and sponsored this event. It was very successful canvassing day. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is the day to the left. This was photo taken outside of Somos Mayfair, where there was where people in the neighborhood, if you could go back, please, where people in the neighborhood were able to walk up if they weren't able to log on to the Board of Supervisor meeting. They could go in person and give their public comment. So this was a very emotional time for me, kind of like Connie talked about with what she experienced during the, when the mayor was reading the apology about Chinatown and how she talked about her personal history. I felt kind of similar. I felt very emotional during this time, just listening to the doctors talk about the lead study and the impacts of lead. I was very emotional during this time because it directly impacts my family and my nieces and nephews and all the kids in the neighborhood. And so we were very excited on August 17th when the Board of Supervisors unanimously voted in support of airport closure. They have since signed on to a petition to ban the use of lead-based fuel, but we are still waiting for the county council to do a petition for early closure. And once they do, there will be an opportunity to give public comment. So that's something to look out for. Next slide, please. So my hopes for the future are that people will get involved with the housing element, especially residents from East San Jose. Josh showed a map about showing racial segregation. This is a map from the Opportunity Map Index, and this is a map that shows segregation based on resources and income. And as you can see, East San Jose and the same part of town that has mostly Latinos and people of color is also happens to be in the low resourced areas. And so my hope for the future is that, we have every 7 years, we have the housing element where people get to plan where to put housing and things like that. And but this year is special because there's a requirement by California law that says we have the duty to affirmatively further fair housing. So and we need local residents, we need people in the neighborhoods in East San Jose, in these impacted communities, to talk about what we want to see, because a part of furthering fair housing is not just where housing is going to go, but also how do we improve our livelihoods and quality of life in low income opportunities. And so I hope that we will and that the decision making power will also stay within District 5, because currently tomorrow, actually at City Council, there's going to be tomorrow, I think they're going to be talking about the redistricting commission. And so we want Reed Hillview Airport to stay within District 5, because this is the community that has been directly impacted. We're below the flight path, and we should be able to have a say in how the land gets repurposed. And whatever happens with the land should be done with the lens towards reparations and create economic empowerment for residents that are living in these areas, and also prevent displacement. So that is that is it. I'm at time.
Yeah, thank you, Maricela.
Thank you, Maricela. So the stories you heard from these two remarkable women are stories of racial exclusion, segregation, and disparate impacts sanctioned through local government action. And of course, there are also stories of resistance. These stories speak to the illustration that I have in this slide, and how at one point government actions and policies were quite explicit, then became more implicit, but still perpetuated inequity along racial and ethnic lines. And now we're at a point, thanks to laws like AB 686, where we can think creatively on how to dismantle policies and practice that have harmed communities and find ways to advance equity. Next slide. So what does this have to do with the housing element? These stories, as I said, are examples of the government's role in perpetuating systems that exclude and disproportionately impact specific groups of people. Racial exclusion in housing in particular has had lasting effects on access to public infrastructure and amenities like parks and other resources. This inequitable geography has led public health experts to point that a person's zip code is one of the best predictors of life expectancy. And it's part of the reason why we continue to see persistent racial inequities in health. Studies have also found that the effects of displacement and the stress of instability can cause severe harm to one's physical and mental health. And now we have a mandate through AB 686 that says we must look at government actions like policies, programs, and funding, and the siting of housing through a fair housing lens to ensure that we do not continue these practices. AB 686 requires cities to take meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity. This law encourages us to promote land use and funding policies that can increase affordable housing in high resource neighborhoods that have often been exclusionary and bring additional resources to traditionally under-resourced neighborhoods. Affirmatively furthering fair housing in California is about achieving better outcomes for all Californians. When everyone has better housing, health, and economic outcomes, we all do better as a whole. Next slide, please. So this just speaks a little bit to what the housing element is. It's a policy document. And while local governments don't build housing, we do create the rules that shape where housing can be built and by how much. And as we mentioned earlier, a new process within housing element is the fair housing analysis and policies and programs. Next slide. So how can you get involved? Well, there's several ways. We strongly encourage you to check out our website, which is listed here. And you can complete our housing goals and needs survey. We'll have that up until the end of the year. So please share with your networks. We have them in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. Please attend our meetings. We have one we're planning right now in December, and the focus will be on fair housing and housing element. In addition, our website has other resources in terms of state laws and other requirements for housing element, our timeline. And you can also sign up to receive updates for any other community meetings or engagement or just updates to the housing element. So this is the first time that the housing element is being done this way, and we really encourage you to provide feedback and contribute your ideas to help us shape the future of housing. If you are part of an organization or a group and you would like to schedule a time for our team to present on the housing element update or a specific other section of the housing element, please reach out to us. Our contact information is also on the website. And that's it on my part.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Well, we're at 5:55, so we maybe have time maybe for one or two questions. Before we get to that, I will note that yes, we will email the attendees today the slide deck and a recording of the presentation, so you will have that. And the resources that Ruth mentioned and the resources that we used to put this presentation together, including the resources from the panelists, was also listed at the end of this presentation, so you can have access to those as well. So I'd like to take a question that was submitted in the Q&A chat that asked about what can be done to protect historic ethnic neighborhoods. I see that Maricela did put in a term there. So I'm wondering if she could expand on that, and maybe we can hear from Connie too, her thoughts on how we can protect those. I think this kind of goes to the larger question what can we do to make sure that these histories are not forgotten? So Maricela, would you like to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and it coincides with both mine and Connie's presentation. And I personally, I think that a cultural district initiative would be really helpful. Cities like San Francisco have cultural district initiatives where they support racial enclaves and support them so that they can be booming economic areas with economic opportunities, like the bus, we all know the Chinatown, and Calle 24 is the Latino cultural district in San Francisco. So I think that, and also anti-displacement policies like a Copa Topa policy supporting tenants so that they can become homeowners also. So I think a lot of economic empowerment, things that are good, policies that are going to help communities of color thrive where they are, and so that they don't get displaced and that the neighborhoods don't get gentrified.
Thank you, Maricela. Connie, what do you think? What do you think can be done to protect these historic
I
ethnic
second
districts?
Maricela's thoughts and her ideas. That's fantastic. I think that we should really recognize that for Asian communities, they've really fought for their own traditions. They have, for instance, if you go to Japantown, you'll see, Japantown markers, benches with this history. You'll see a kiosk that talks about the relocation of the Japanese Americans. You'll walk down the street and there will be the Japanese American Museum, which has continuing exhibits and programs. So within the communities, people themselves have continued the history, and they've based a lot of their work on oral history, collecting oral histories. And also, if you want to see the original temple gods from the Unshingong Temple in Highlandville, you can go to History Park. There is the replica building of the temple, which was built by the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project. And they also have beautiful exhibits and ongoing programs in educating, students and trying to influence the curriculum of the communities. So we're trying to do a lot ourselves, and we have succeeded, but certainly we need all the civic and government help that we can get. I mean, that would be marvelous.
Great. Well, there you go. I think that's a great place to end. Further ways to get involved. So I want to again thank everyone for participating and for attending tonight. Like I said, we will email out the copies of the presentation. If you submitted a question that wasn't answered, we have your email addresses so we can reach out to you and follow up on your question that way. So thank you again. Thank you especially to Connie and Maricela. I very much appreciated hearing their stories and all that they've done in their lives to get to this point to share with us. So thank you so much. Thank you to Connie and Ruth, so Josh and Ruth from the staff, and to Lori and David who helped from the city tonight. So
thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. I just wanted to, as we're leaving, wanted to credit two more organizations that I forgot. Luna and Community Health Partnerships were also very helpful in getting the airport closure stuff through.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Night.